Hello and welcome to our interview series OCD Stories. I'd like to welcome KEVIN FOSS here and thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us. You are the founder of California OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center, and I'd like to ask you if you would talk about yourself first, who you are, and how you are related to OCD.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I'm the founder and director of the California OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. It's a private practice focusing on OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders. And I'm a licensed therapist in California and in Montana as well. But licensed therapist specializing in these things. I also run a podcast called the Fearcast Podcast, which is a question and answer based show for folks who want to ask questions about OCD and anxiety treatment, and I answer those on a bi-weekly basis.
Thank you again for being here, KEVIN. And could you maybe specify a little bit how you got entangled into the topic of OCD over the last years?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. When I first started graduate school, I didn't have any intention specifically to work with anxiety disorders, but through graduate school, I got some advice from someone. I originally wanted to, at the end of graduate school, I wanted to work with musicians and artists and folks like that. Based off of oddly enough, seeing a Metallica documentary, and there was a family therapist working with the band, and I said, that's what I want to do. So I got some advice from someone. They said, well, get some training in anxiety. That'll be a good start. So I ended up getting an internship with an intensive outpatient programs focusing on OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders. And from there, I just fell in love with working with that and have been doing that since 2008.
That's quite a long time. And it sounds like it's intrinsic motivation that's driving you forward to do this over 10 years now. Is this right?
Working with anxiety it's remarkably rewarding because you can see a tremendous amount of change in someone's life with even just a little bit of intervention, with a little bit of work. You can see someone start to overcome and get through their anxieties. So seeing that is very encouraging for a clinician. I've also I just love working with the OCD community. They're just an incredibly warm, incredibly kind, incredibly kind and warm group of folks. And I've just appreciated being a part of these people's stories.
So why did you decide to share your knowledge and experience about this topic, and what do you think is important about this?
Maybe it's best to address. I mean, why I try to do a lot of writings or try to get good information out through my podcast is while there is increasingly more and more good information about OCD and anxiety treatment, there is a ton of bad information out there too, and unhelpful information. So getting information that's going to be helpful, that's going to be applicable, and it's going to be tangible for people who perhaps don't have access to treatment or don't have access to effective treatment is an incredible motivator for me. So I'm trying to make OCD treatment and anxiety treatment something that seems doable, that seems workable for people's lives. There can be a lot of information for treatment that sounds very esoteric, can sound very abstract, but the work that we're doing is very tangible and is very practical in everyday life. So I want to try to make that accessible to as many people as possible.
I think that is a very nice educational approach. And since you are an expert on OCD, could you define OCD as a psychological disease itself and explain about the various types of OCD there are for the listeners who are not experienced in this kind of topic. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like you're referring to a lot of the various subtypes that you might read about. As you start to read about OCD more and more, you'll start to read different titles and different subtypes or different manifestations of it. It's important to remember that obsessive compulsive disorder is one singular diagnosis in terms of how it is diagnosed from the DSM or the IDC-10. It is just one disorder. However, within that, we have kind of developed a shorthand by using these subtitles to help designate and kind of, again, it's a shorthand so that when we're talking about someone's obsessions, we can use one single word or one designation, and we go, okay, I kind of know the cluster of things that this person is thinking about, is worried about, or I know what sort of compulsions this person is doing. So, for example, the classic type of compulsions or obsessions within OCD that we see is contamination obsessions. So we might call it contamination OCD, and that's going to be someone who's worried about dirt or germs or feeling yucky or gross. And that's you commonly see that on TV or movies, and that's someone who's washing a lot or opens doors with napkins or paper towels or things like that. And that's just one subtype. You'll also have things like something called HOCD or SOOCD or sexual orientation OCD. All those are kind of the same thing, and those terms are shifting from time to time. But sexual orientation OCD is a obsession about someone's sexual orientation and whether or not they know their sexual orientation, whether or not they are currently gay or lesbian, or whether they're going to become gay or lesbian in the future. There's relationship OCD, ROCD for short. That's going to be where someone is obsessed about the quality of their relationship. Do they love the other person? And their compulsions are going to be focused on evaluating the status or quality or quantity of their feelings towards this other person. And it can all, and there's a myriad of other types. There can be religious and moral scrupulosity, which is a hyper concern about one's in moral scrupe. It can be their just moral character. Are they doing the right thing, or did they offend someone's feelings? Did they lie or cheat or steal at some point, maybe in the past? Religious scrupulosity being whether or not they're religious, or that whether they are doing the right things within their religious background. And that can be questioning whether or not they are, quote, saved, whether or not they have done some sort of sin, either intentionally or unintentionally. And then a lot of and they can also then read the Bible or read their particular religious text over and over and over and over again to regain that sense of certainty and confidence that everything is okay. But this is just naming a few, but there are a number of other different types of OCD. I suppose I don't know if you want me to keep going into that, but those are just some examples of how widespread the anxiety or the things that we can worry about. I've often said our anxiety and fear is only limited by our human imagination, and you and I can imagine a lot of stuff.
That's true.
So if you can imagine it, you can probably be afraid of it and probably be obsessed on it, even abstract things. I've worked with folks in something called existential OCD, where they are worried about whether or not we're real, whether or not you're real. How do I know that you are a real person and not a figment of my imagination? How do I know that? So I when you sent me the email about this interview, I looked at my calendar and thought about whether or not it'd be a good idea to do this, and then I decided to do this interview with you. But did I? Am I certain that I had that free choice to do that, or is that just going to be? Was that a decision that was decided by the universe, and it is all determination? It was determined by my actions because, you can see my fancy microphone. I obviously do interviews and I do my podcast, so of course I want to talk about OCD. If you emailed me about it, of course I'm going to do that. So is that just something that, of course, I was going to do? Or did I choose to do it? So folks can obsess about that. So it is OCD is a very broad and very rich landscape of things that you can be worried about.
Thank you very much for giving a little insight on some of the various types of OCD. And on the website, I read that you have a personal and unique interest into a certain type of OCD, which is called scrupulosity OCD. And I was wondering, where did that come from, and why are you interested in this specific kind? Could you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you're right. I do have a particular interest in working with religious scrupulosity, and I often work with folks from a Christian or Catholic background. Not and I find it particularly interesting in just how OCD will latch itself onto things of greatest value to us. So perhaps to the other point that you said is OCD, it will, as I mentioned, it latches its on to things that we find most important, most central, and most valuable to us as people. Um, so, so for someone of tremendous faith, or someone who actually cares about their faith, um, if you are predisposed to OCD in the OCD cycle, it's possible, and I'll just say it's possible at this point, that OCD is going to eventually grab onto that faith and is going to inspire a sense of doubt, questions about your faith, about how it's working, how you're doing. Are you doing your faith correctly? Could you be doing it better? Did you have any errors in it? So it's a so yeah, I find it interesting to work with folks to try to help them do something that's actually very difficult to do, which is to try to find a more functional way to live their faith. Because it's not to say we want to completely abandon someone's faith when working with religious scrupulosity, because avoidance of their faith is not the solution. But what they have been doing, which is excessively rigid adherence to things, doing rituals, or doing spiritual activities, or doing things that they believe are spiritually appropriate activities, doing them well beyond what the average person in their church or religious community would do, that is obviously not working for them either. So trying to find a middle ground where they are able to more appropriately engage with their faith, with their spirituality, however you want to call it, in a way that feels more rewarding to them without becoming all encompassing. That's been a big passion of mine.
Thank you. I think you sound very passionate while talking about it, and this triggers my personal interest, but I hope it will also trigger the interest of the listeners, and yeah, maybe be a motivation to look a little bit more into what kind of various types there are and how they appear. And you mentioned a predisposition as one part of a cause for OCD. Did you identify more causes? Of course, they would be quite individual, but maybe there are some certain things that appear more often.
In terms of how OCD starts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So they haven't narrowed down to exactly what causes OCD or anxiety, for that matter. There is research going on right now to try to find or to try to identify some genetic markers that would help identify folks who are predisposed to it. But the prevailing knowledge thus far is that it's a both nature and nurture approach, meaning there is going to be a little bit of nature involved. So there's going to be a biological component to it, and there is a genetic component to it. So if someone's parents have it, there is a statistical likelihood that their children will have it as well. Now, that being said, there's a nurture component to it too. So so just because you have the genetic components to it doesn't mean that you absolutely it will manifest. It will depend on someone's experiences, and sometimes people will experience struggles, stresses, and even traumas in life that will help make these symptoms manifest faster. Um, yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it definitely does answer the questions. Thank you a lot for the little overview. So you are already working with OCD and anxiety patients for over 10 years now. Could you report a little bit about the various treatments there are, and also specifically which kind of treatment you are applying?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the approach that I use is part of what has been called the gold standard of OCD treatment. So that is going to be cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response prevention, and mindfulness-based techniques. And specifically, I'll use an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy. Now, the techniques that people are using are changing, and people do add things on, and and people will experiment with different things to try to augment the treatment process. However, over time and consistently, cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure and response prevention have been proven to be the most effective treatment methods for OCD and anxiety. So I can tell you what those are in a nutshell, if that's
that would be great.
Okay. So cognitive behavioral therapy is so you'll hear it as CBT. Often hear as that. What that focuses on is that you can think about it as your thoughts, cognitions, and behaviors, right? Your actions. So we're looking at how your thoughts and how you think about the world, how you interpret the world, your interactions with other people, yourself, how you think about all those things will influence what you do, your behaviors, right? So my favorite example for this is, like snakes, right? Snakes themselves are neither good nor bad. But if we think that all snakes are dangerous and all snakes are poisonous, well, if I see a snake, then I'm going to run because I don't want to die. But as perhaps you and I both know, not all snakes are poisonous. And just because there's a poisonous snake doesn't mean it's going to bite you. And just because it bites you doesn't mean you're going to die. So if we can challenge that initial thought about snakes, that maybe not all snakes are dangerous, maybe we can help identify which ones are and aren't dangerous. Maybe we can identify some safe ways to interact with snakes. We can rethink our thoughts, then notice that if we have that bit of information, it will change what we do. Because now with all of that new information, I can then say, all right, there's a snake. Well, what do I now know about snakes? What do I now know how to interact with them? What can I do? That will influence whether or not I just immediately run, or if I stay and continue doing whatever it is that I was doing that brought me to the snake in the first place. So that's the same pattern that can happen with perhaps talking about contamination. We can challenge that feared story that someone has about touching doorknobs, right? For example, again, the classic example, right? Someone might have this fear: if I touch this doorknob, it might have some sort of illness on it that I'm going to get. I might spread it to my family, and then I could be responsible for myself or them dying. So I better wash my hands, right? Because we'll get into that in a minute. So if I can rethink this thought and say, well, maybe I can't be certain that there's something on that doorknob. How do I know? I didn't see anybody sneeze on it. I'm looking at the doorknob. I don't see anything that specifically says there's COVID or something else on it. So maybe, and I've touched doorknobs a lot. Thousands and millions and billions of other people have also touched doorknobs and have not died of crazy weird diseases. So I can't be certain that there is. No, but remember, I can't be certain that there isn't. So, but based on that, am I willing to take the risk to maybe touch that doorknob like the average person, and take the risk that, likely speaking, there wasn't anything on it in the first place? And the more that we do that, the more that we can start to realize that touching doorknobs without washing your hands is likely safe. It's likely fine. Now, I've already kind of incorporated exposure and response prevention in that. So exposure and response prevention, also called exposure and relapse prevention. No, that's not it. Exposure and ritual prevention. That's what people call it. So ERP for short. what that process is, that fits into the behavioral component. Because remember, if we've challenged our thoughts, we're going to challenge our behaviors. This is where ERP comes in. This is where we're going to identify the things that we're afraid of and progressively get closer and closer towards doing and facing that fear. And in the course of doing that, we learn that what we're afraid of, we learn a couple things. One, what we're afraid of is probably not going to happen. It's probably not. We send this message to our brain over and over when we face our fear, face our fear. Our brain goes, oh, you know what? I did that thing, even though my brain told me it was going to be terrible and awful. I did this thing, and it actually wasn't that bad. So we start to relearn that things are going to be okay. We also, through that process, we get used to that experience, and our anxiety starts to come down, and we learn to habituate, or we do habituate to that experience. Now, it doesn't mean that we forget about it. It doesn't mean that we then say, like, everything's fine. We might still have anxiety, but we learn that we can move forward in life without doing compulsions. So for example, with that doorknob, I can touch that doorknob. We learn over time. I can touch that doorknob, open the door, and learn that I can do that without washing my hands. So I don't need my compulsions to live my life. I don't need to seek safety, certainty. I don't need to ask someone for permission or reassurance that everything's going to be okay in order for me to get through this or to tamp down this anxiety. Because anxiety is just a feeling that we have that tells us that something may or may not be dangerous and brings attention to something. But anxiety does not mean that that fear is true. It just means that it's our brain waving a big red flag to say, hey, pay attention to this thing. So we learn over time through exposure and response prevention that we can survive and tolerate anxiety without doing compulsions and rituals. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does, totally. Thank you very much for those tangible examples. I think that gives a little insight on how those treatments work initially. Is there something that you can extract from your experiences that you would advise to people who are in a relationship with someone who is affected by OCD? Doesn't matter if it's a love relationship or friends or family. Do you have some advices for those people?
Yeah. My advice to someone with who has a loved one, a family member, a partner who has OCD is first to try to learn as much as you can about the disorder itself. So learning about the OCD cycle, learning about what treatment looks like, can have a tremendous impact on their understanding of what their partner is going through. And in the course of learning about treatment, they will also, hopefully, they will also learn about ways that they can most effectively interact with their partner that are going to be supportive, but are also not going to be accommodating for, meaning not going to be inappropriately helping the disorder itself. Because a lot of family members and loved ones will see their partner in the midst of their anxiety, and they'll say, well, if I can just wash this thing for them, if I can just tell them that everything's going to be okay and that they didn't hurt my feelings, or that our marriage is going to last forever, like whatever the thing is that they feel that they have to say to make their partner feel better, they are willing to do that. But the problem with OCD is that it's often called the doubting disease. So it doesn't matter how much reassurance we give a partner or give someone with OCD, the disease itself is going to doubt or question the information, the earnestness of the answer, or is just going to ask some other doubtful question that is going to require more reassurance. So my best advice for a loved one, again, is to educate themselves, but also to give themselves permission to not give their partner, their loved one, reassurances. Don't be victim to their anxiety. So we're not trying to accommodate for their anxieties. We want to love that person and tell them how much, validate how much anxiety they have, how much pain they have, but we also don't want to play the game of giving them reassurances or participating in their compulsions, because that is ultimately just going to make them sicker and sicker. It'd be like giving alcohol to an alcoholic, giving drugs to a drug addict. It's akin to that. So it doesn't mean that we stop loving them. It just means we want to pull back from any compulsions or that we are participating in with them. And though it might feel uncomfortable and feel terrible to do that, because we're going to think it's causing them more pain and that we're bad people because we're not helping them. But in reality, we are helping them by not participating in their compulsive cycles. We are helping them. So I'd embolden them to learn about the process, learn about their partner's compulsive cycles, and then make the decision to not engage with their compulsions with them.
Thank you very much for sharing your advices. Would you say there is a public lack of empathy regarding psychological diseases and specifically OCD?
Yeah, I think that there can be a lack of empathy, and I think some of that lack of empathy is also based on misinformation or a lack of information. So I think, as I mentioned with OCD, since we're specifically talking about that, you might hear people say things like, "I'm so OCD about this," or you see things like T-shirts that say like "Obsessive Christmas Disorder" around Christmas time, and for a lot of people in the OCD community, that's taken as incredibly offensive and minimizing their experience and their pain, because it's seemingly making a joke out of what is to them a incredibly painful and limiting disorder. So what I, so I think that the vast majority of folks who are using that aren't intending to make those jokes to ridicule someone with OCD. I think that they are doing it absent-mindedly, and that person could use some education as to what OCD actually is. That being said, people are also just mean and will do terrible things. So, some people are just mean. So there is that component to it. But yes, I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about what OCD actually is. Some people, again, they just think it's being particular, or it's being really clean, or liking things really clean and organized. And yes, certain components of OCD can include organization, symmetry, cleanliness, but that's obviously not what all of it is. In fact, you might hear people talk about who have OCD, and they'll say, "My room is incredibly messy," or "My house is incredibly dirty, but I have to read these books 8 hours a day," or "I have to do X, Y, or Z compulsions that have nothing to do with cleaning, order, or symmetry." So educating folks on what OCD actually is can be really helpful. I think to expand out just from OCD, I think there is also a poor use of words that describe other disorders as well. So things like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar are also used kind of flagrantly, and don't take into account what the actual disorder is. Some people will say, if they're really happy one day and really sad the next day for whatever reason, or they didn't sleep well, so they're kind of crabby, they might say, "Oh, I'm really bipolar today." Well, that's not what bipolar disorder is. So helping someone understand what that actually is, and reminding them what this actually is, can help destigmatize and help educate people who may be ignorant of what these disorders actually are.
Regarding this public perception of OCD, I have another question. Do you think that the way cities are planned and the public is shaped and designed influences OCD in positive or negative ways? And if yes, what do you think the triggers are?
There can be some things that can just generally help mental health is creating more of a lifestyle of mental health, and that can include having downtime, having intentional time where we are not working, having more of a connection with other people, not trying to have to rush to the next place and have to be there on time, or else, some terribleness will happen. Um, some of those things, and or creating some space in one's life, and working on building connections, a healthier lifestyle with food, healthy, or excuse me, eating healthy food, exercising, minimizing drug and alcohol use, minimizing and eliminating smoking. All of those things create a lifestyle of health, and will also impact our in a positive way, impact our mental health. So that all those things can really help. I do think one of to the point about globalization, because we have access to the internet, which allows you and me to talk very easily on the opposite sides of the world. While that may be true, it is also having immediate access to all sorts of information feeds this feeds OCDs to a certain degree, need for information and certainty. So while we may have questions, and 30 years ago we may have had questions about something, but we just didn't have an answer to it, so we had to accept uncertainty about the answer, and we practiced that, and we were okay with that. Whereas now we have access to all bits of information. We can contact someone, we can look it up. So we are feeding that desire in us, and there's a natural desire in people to want to know and want to get answers, which is a great thing, except when it comes to our insatiable need to get answers, because there are just some things that we simply won't be able to get answers to. So in terms of that, um, that has been a problem. And we can also talk about the mental health impact of social media, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all those things, and those do have a detrimental effect on folks' mental health. But that might be for another question or another interview.
Yes, you're right. Probably this is a topic for another session. But we are also by now all aware of the influences of social media, I guess. So we come to our last question, and this one is a little bit more specifically related to our project and the approach to create more awareness towards OCD and build bridges of empathy between affected people and people that are not affected and maybe also never heard about it. So do you think that visible interventions like posters and little reminders in the public space regarding OCD would help our approach to create awareness and more understanding towards those conditions?
Yeah, I actually think it might. If there was a clever marketing campaign that we're able to explain, explain, at least in a cursory way, or a simplistic way, what OCD is, or what subtypes of OCD can be, and to that point, what other disorders might be, what depression is, what generalized anxiety or social anxiety, things like that. That may help people to one, understand what those disorders are, be able to gain some insight into what those are, and develop some empathy for people who may be experiencing them. It can also be incredibly helpful for folks who do have the disorder and may not know it. A lot of people who have these disorders go years, decades without knowing that they have OCD or another, and one of the subtypes, because they don't share this. They're terrified to tell someone about their fears, because they think that they are terrible or evil, or violent, or somehow bad, if they were to have this, or they think they're crazy or going crazy. So there is a lot of fear of sharing their thoughts with someone else, because they worry about what someone else might think. um, I've had people watch, listen to my podcast, or watch videos, or see something on TV that talked about a subtype of OCD, and it triggered for them. Oh, I have that. I've had those thoughts. So hearing and seeing about someone who has similar obsessions, worries, and the similar experiences to them can be incredibly validating and incredibly informative for them to know that they're not the only person out there, that they are not crazy, and that there is help out there. So having again a really clever marketing campaign might be helpful for helping people get the help that they need and get the understanding that they so deserve.
And this educational approach we're somehow trying to fulfill with this project, of course, it is just a little part of a big process, but through sharing those information and talking with each other like we do now, we prepare the nutrition ground for empathy and interest to grow. And yes, I'm very thankful that you decided to be part of this project, and I really want to thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for your project, and again, I'm honored to be a part of it. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much as well, Kevin, and goodbye.